I opened the barn door expecting to check on my goats and maybe sweep out some hay, but instead I walked straight into what looked like a runway show for confused city people. A giant ring light blinded me. A woman in high heels was pretending to milk a bucket that wasn't even under a cow. A man with a megaphone shouted "Pose like you love the land," while a drone hovered dangerously close to my rafters. And standing in the middle of it all like she was the queen of cornfields was Karen from the HOA, holding a clipboard and giving orders like it was her property. My property. My barn. The same barn I built with my father 15 years ago using reclaimed wood and more sweat than money. And now it had been turned into a fashion photoshoot for people who probably think hay comes in flavor packets. I didn't say a word. I just stood there staring while one of the models draped a lace shawl over my saddle rack. That was the moment I realized something inside me had snapped. Not just because they invaded my barn without permission. Not just because they called it community adjacent like that made it fair game. But because they did it with the smug confidence of people who thought no one would dare fight back. And that's when I decided they were about to learn what happens when you steal from a farmer with a working manure wagon and absolutely nothing left to lose. It all started 2 days earlier when I noticed some strange vans driving around the property. My land backs up to a walking trail that technically runs through the HOA community, but my barn sits on the far side of the boundary fence with clear signage saying private property, no trespassing. Apparently, those signs were invisible to the HOA board because by Friday morning there were people setting up tripods and pinning fabric sheets to my barn walls like it was a movie set. At first, I thought maybe someone got lost or had the wrong address. I walked up and introduced myself politely, asking what they were doing. That's when Karen turned around. You could tell she was the ringleader because she had that energy. The kind that says I have absolutely no authority, but I'm going to act like I do anyway. She didn't introduce herself. She just smiled like I was the help and said, "Oh good, you're here, we need the bales moved over to the left." I blinked at her and asked again what was going on. That's when she waved a paper in my face and said, "This is an authorized HOA event, thank you for cooperating." I took the paper and scanned it. It was a blurry photocopy of some kind of internal HOA newsletter with an article titled "Bringing Country Glam to the Suburbs" and a paragraph claiming they'd secured the use of a local barn for a lifestyle shoot. Nowhere did it say my name. Nowhere was there a signature. It was just a generic flyer with a few sentences and the HOA logo badly photoshopped into the corner. I told her there was no agreement and no permission given. She smiled tighter and said, "As an HOA board member, I'm empowered to make executive aesthetic decisions." I said, "This isn't an aesthetic, this is my barn." She shrugged and said the community needs rustic appeal, and it's visible from the trail, so it's a shared visual asset. That was the first time I heard that ridiculous phrase. Shared visual asset. I didn't even know what that meant, but I knew it sounded like lawyer bait. I walked away before I said something I'd regret and started calling people. First my neighbor Clay, who's a former sheriff's deputy. Then my cousin Tara, who's a property lawyer. Both were furious and told me this was a blatant violation. Tara even asked if I wanted to file trespassing charges that day. I told her not yet. I had an idea. A very specific idea involving a wagon I hadn't used in years but kept around just in case. Because the thing about farmers is we don't forget how to use tools. Even the ones that smell bad and require gloves and a high tolerance for public disgust. I spent that night tuning it up in the shed, checking the pressure lines and making sure the spreader still worked. It did. Beautifully. The next morning I went back to the barn pretending to be cooperative. Karen greeted me like I was a stagehand and told me the models would be arriving shortly and could I please scoop out any remaining hay because it clashes with the white theme. I nodded and started cleaning, but not the way she meant. I moved bales strategically. I rearranged some feed sacks. I plugged in an old extension cord that just happened to reach my setup point behind the barn. I even laid down a few scent markers to encourage the goats to stay away. No need for innocent bystanders when the curtain dropped. By noon the whole crew was there. Karen had hired 2 Instagram influencers who clearly had never been on a farm in their lives. One of them tried to hand-feed a chicken with kale chips and screamed when it pecked her nail polish. A stylist was yelling about lighting angles while a tech guy fiddled with the drone trying to get it to fly between the rafters for a dynamic shot. Karen stood in the middle of it, all beaming like a queen in a crown made of entitlement. She kept saying things like, "We're going to revolutionize HOA marketing, and this barn is going to make the cover of the spring edition." Meanwhile, I was checking my watch. Timing mattered. When Karen finally yelled quiet on set, I knew we were close. She lined everyone up in the main entryway and directed the drone to hover overhead. The models struck their poses. One sat on my saddle rack with a lace curtain behind her, and the other leaned on a pitchfork like she'd just invented manual labor. Karen stood to the side ready to take credit for everything. I waited for her to give the final command. And when she said roll cameras, I smiled. I stepped back behind the support beam and hit the switch. There was a low whirring sound at first. No one noticed. Then the pressure line hissed. The manure wagon was a good 20 feet back, but its hose was coiled and aimed dead center at the barn's open doors. 3 seconds later the first spray hit. A thick, steaming blast of fertilizer arced through the air and landed right in the middle of the white rug Karen had unrolled for ambience. The shrieks were immediate. One model dove behind a hay bale. The other tripped and fell into the goat pen. The drone swerved wildly and crashed into the rafters, sending hay tumbling like confetti. Karen screamed something about a lawsuit and ran toward the back, only to get hit with a second spray full in the side. And me, I stood calmly watching the chaos unfold, arms crossed, satisfied. Because they wanted a rustic experience. I just gave them one they'd never forget. The smell lingered longer than any of them expected. By the time the manure wagon wheezed its last splatter, and I shut it down, the barn looked like a battlefield where glamour went to die. Karen stood frozen in place, her once crisp white blouse now blotched in brown and green like a camouflage pattern gone horribly wrong. Her mouth was still open, as if trying to catch up with the disaster unfolding around her. The model in the goat pen was now crying, holding one broken heel in her hand like a fallen comrade, and the influencer with the kale chips was screaming about her ruined partnership with an organic lotion brand. The photographer shouted that his equipment was waterproof, but not this waterproof, and the stylist had taken off running through the fields in search of clean air. It was a masterpiece of destruction, and I hadn't even broken a sweat. I didn't say a word. I just tipped my hat and walked away like a cowboy riding off after a high-noon shootout. But not before I made sure to retrieve the memory card from the security camera hidden behind the feed sack. I had footage from 3 different angles, including the drone's feed before it spiraled into hay dust. I knew they'd try to rewrite the narrative, and I wanted the truth saved in glorious high definition. By the time I reached my porch, I could already hear Karen shouting into her phone, likely calling every HOA board member and emergency dry cleaner within 50 miles. She didn't realize yet that her real problem wasn't the manure. It was me. Later that evening, I uploaded the footage to a private group called Entitled HOA Nightmares. Just a short, clean edit. No music, no commentary. Just raw, unfiltered chaos titled Karen Tries Rustic Fashion Shoot, Gets a Taste of the Country. I didn't expect much. Maybe a few laughs from people who had their own stories of HOA madness. But by midnight, the video had over 70,000 views and 1,000 comments. Turns out people really enjoy watching overly entitled board members get their comeuppance via high-velocity farm waste. I went to bed smiling, not even caring that my boots still smelled faintly of fertilizer. By the next morning, things had escalated. I woke up to 5 voicemails, 2 HOA emails marked urgent, and a suspiciously folded letter taped to my mailbox. The first voicemail was from Karen herself, trying to sound composed but obviously furious. She said she was giving me one final chance to apologize and pay for the damages before legal action would be taken. The second message was from HOA Vice President Bob, who sounded like he'd been roped into the drama and wanted to defuse things with a neighborly conversation. The third was from some guy named Julian claiming to be a publicist representing the photographer, demanding I take down the video and issue a public apology for defamation and loss of creative integrity. I laughed out loud. Creative integrity. They were lucky I didn't post the outtakes. Instead of responding, I made coffee and watched the latest repost. Someone had added dramatic music. Another person had dubbed over Karen's scream with the sound of a foghorn. The meme pages had grabbed it too. One showed Karen's manure-covered face with the caption, "When you try to own the barn but the barn owns you." Another had edited in goats wearing sunglasses while the words "HOA got wrecked" scrolled across the screen. It was glorious, and it was growing. By noon, a local radio host was talking about it live on air, reading listener comments and laughing so hard he had to take a break. I'd accidentally gone viral, and Karen had just become a national punchline. That's when things got serious. A man in a cheap suit and a too shiny tie showed up at my gate claiming to be HOA legal counsel. He handed me a thick envelope and said with a smirk that they were pursuing damages for emotional trauma, property contamination, and unauthorized surveillance. I didn't say a word. I just took the envelope, opened it slowly, and started reading while he stood there waiting for a reaction. I pointed out the typo in the first paragraph, where they'd spelled barn as bran. Then I looked him in the eye and said, "Do you want to know how many cameras are watching this exact moment?" He stiffened, glanced around, and left without another word. I called Tara, my cousin the lawyer, and read the document aloud to her. She laughed so hard she choked on her coffee. She told me to sit tight and not respond. Meanwhile, she drafted a letter of her own, complete with photos of my clearly posted private property signs and screenshots from the HOA bylaws stating they had no jurisdiction over my land. She even included a copy of the forged approval notice Karen had shown me that first day. Apparently, using the HOA logo without board consensus and then trespassing onto non-HOA property was a legal disaster waiting to happen. Tara's words were music to my ears. She said if they push this, they'll bury themselves in legal compost. Karen, unfortunately, didn't get the memo. The next day she organized an emergency HOA board meeting. It was supposed to be closed door, but someone live-streamed it from their phone. Probably Randy from Lot 14, who hates Karen almost as much as I do. The video showed Karen trying to maintain her composure while wearing sunglasses indoors and pretending not to be embarrassed. She called the incident a coordinated attack on HOA reputation and suggested using funds to hire a crisis PR firm. Someone in the background yelled, "Are you seriously spending our dues because you rolled in cow crap?" and the whole room broke into laughter. Karen tried to regain control, but it was too late. The clip went viral within hours, with the top comment being "Sometimes karma doesn't knock, it just sprays." The following day, I got a message from a local reporter asking for an interview. At first, I declined, but then I saw Karen had already given a statement claiming I'd set a trap and endangered lives for attention. That's when I said sure, come on down. The reporter showed up with a small crew, and I walked them through everything, from the surprise invasion to the manure finale. I even showed them the original paper Karen waved in my face and the footage of her claiming executive aesthetic authority. The segment aired that night on the 6 o'clock news with the headline "Local Farmer Defends Barn Against Unauthorized HOA Invasion." They showed a split screen of my calm interview and Karen slipping in the goat pen. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from people across the country, cheering me on and sharing their own HOA horror stories. But not everyone was laughing. Karen, humiliated, doubled down. She started a petition to have me removed from the community mailing list and declared me a public nuisance. She even filed an official HOA complaint accusing me of hostile behavior and improper use of agricultural machinery. I responded with a printout of every law she broke, stapled to a fresh bag of fertilizer, and left at her doorstep. The note said you might want to read this before your next photo shoot. At this point, even other HOA board members were distancing themselves from her. One of them, a quiet man named Dennis, stopped by my place and set off the record that Karen was acting alone and misusing her position. He hinted that there might be a vote soon. A very important one. I thanked him, and before he left, he looked at the manure wagon and asked, "Does that thing have a name?" I smiled and said it does now. Meet the Equalizer. By the third day, the Equalizer had become more famous than my actual farm. People were driving by just to catch a glimpse of it. A family from 2 towns over brought their kids to take pictures in front of the now infamous manure wagon. Someone left a thank you note tucked under one of the wheels, saying they'd watch the video every day that week just to start their morning with a laugh. I didn't mind the attention. In fact, I found it oddly satisfying that something so basic and functional, something meant for mucking fields, had become a symbol of standing up against entitled nonsense. Meanwhile, Karen was unraveling faster than a hay bale in a windstorm. She wasn't done with me yet. Early that morning, I saw a new sign posted at the entrance of the walking trail behind my property. It read "Restricted HOA member access only." Beneath it was a laminated paper with my name printed in all caps under the phrase "Suspended from community events until further notice." The ridiculous part was that I'd never participated in those events to begin with. Karen was trying to act like I'd been banished from some high society club when in reality, I preferred tractor pulls and livestock auctions over HOA wine tastings. Still, her desperate need to assert control was almost impressive in its delusion. Later that afternoon, I noticed a group of HOA board members pulling into the cul-de-sac in their little convoy of identical gray SUVs. It was clearly an unannounced inspection. Karen strutted ahead of the group, wearing a large sun hat and sunglasses, talking into a Bluetooth headset like she was on a high-stakes diplomatic mission. Behind her, the others looked less enthusiastic. One woman clutched a clipboard but kept glancing at Karen like she was regretting every decision that led her there. Another man just looked tired. Karen led them to the edge of my property line and pointed aggressively at the barn, talking loud enough for me to hear words like contamination zone, community image risk, and long-term removal. It was clear she was trying to drum up support for some kind of enforcement action. What she didn't know was that I'd been recording everything. I walked out to greet them, camera already rolling, and asked if they needed help with anything. Karen turned, visibly startled, then tried to regain her authority by saying I was not to interfere with official HOA assessments. I reminded her that they were standing on my land without permission. The woman with the clipboard awkwardly shuffled backward and muttered something about not realizing the boundary line. I offered them lemonade just to throw Karen off balance, and when she declined, I smiled and said that was a shame. It pairs really well with reality checks. That night, I compiled the footage from their little visit and added it to my growing folder of Karen vs. Logic. I had dozens of clips by now, each one more absurd than the last. There was Karen trying to argue with a neighbor about mailbox font regulations, Karen lecturing someone about grass length while standing in flip-flops, and even Karen tripping over her own extension cord during the original barn fiasco. It was starting to feel like a sitcom, except it was real, and unfortunately, the consequences were not just for laughs. Things came to a head when Karen filed an official report with the County Agricultural Board. She claimed my barn was operating outside zoning regulations and presented them with manipulated photos of the manure spread as evidence of environmental hazard. The fact that she had doctored the pictures was obvious to anyone with eyes. She'd used some kind of app that made the fertilizer spray look like it reached the tree line when in reality it never left the barn. But she underestimated the patience of the board and the accuracy of my own record. When an inspector showed up, I gave him a full tour, handed over soil quality reports, and even showed him the Equalizer in all its innocent, rusty glory. He laughed and said she'd submitted 5 complaints in the past year, and not one had held up. As Karen's grip on the HOA began to loosen, something unexpected happened. More neighbors started dropping by, not to complain, but to talk. Turns out I wasn't the only one who'd had enough. One elderly couple told me she fined them $300 for having too many wind chimes. Another said she once tried to confiscate their garden gnome collection for being unlicensed decorations. People were tired. Tired of the power games, tired of the surprise inspections, tired of being treated like misbehaving children in their own homes. The barn debacle had opened a floodgate. The final straw came during the monthly HOA meeting, which was usually a boring affair attended by a handful of diehards. This time, nearly the entire neighborhood showed up. The room was packed, folding chairs dragged in from every corner, people standing shoulder to shoulder. Karen walked in confidently, not realizing that the tide had completely turned against her. She launched into a speech about community values and accountability, trying to spin the incident at my barn into a cautionary tale about unruly residents. But the audience wasn't buying it. One man shouted, "What about the fake photos?" Someone else held up a sign that read, "We are not your prop." Laughter rippled through the room, and Karen's composure began to crack. I stood quietly near the back until they opened the floor to public comment. Then I stepped forward, calm and clear. I laid out the timeline of events. I explained how no permission had ever been granted. I read from the trespassing laws. I held up the forged document she'd used to justify the shoot. Then I clicked a remote and played a short video montage of her greatest hits, ending with her shrieking in the barn doorway as the manure spray hit the rug. The room erupted in cheers and applause. Karen tried to object but was drowned out by a unanimous chant from the crowd. "Vote her out." The board held an emergency motion then and there. With hands raised and voices loud, Karen was removed from her position as HOA president effective immediately. She stood in stunned silence, unable to believe what had just happened. A few people clapped her on the back awkwardly as she exited the room, but most turned away. By the time she reached the parking lot, her sun hat had drooped and her glasses were off. She looked smaller, deflated, like a balloon finally out of hot air. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate in front of her. But that night, back at the barn, I poured myself a glass of lemonade, leaned against the doorway, and looked out at the Equalizer with quiet satisfaction. It had started as a simple act of revenge, but it ended up revealing something much deeper, a shared frustration, a neighborhood tired of being pushed around, a community finding its backbone again. The Equalizer hadn't just sprayed fertilizer. It had fertilized change, and somehow that felt like a harvest worth toasting. 3 days after the vote, everything started to shift. The neighborhood had gone from tiptoeing around Karen's orders to practically celebrating her departure like it was a national holiday. You could feel it in the air. There was more laughter, more neighbors chatting on porches, more life. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like someone was watching us from behind the HOA bylaws, waiting to pounce. And while Karen wasn't technically gone, her house still stood 3 blocks away, and she still slinked around in that overly tinted SUV of hers. Her power was gone, deflated and hollow. The HOA board, now operating under the leadership of Dennis, the formerly quiet man who had stopped by my place with questions about the Equalizer, was actually listening to residents. They were reviewing old rules, removing ridiculous fines, and even hosting an open forum to invite input on community decisions. For once, it felt like we were all adults living in the same place instead of inmates under a micromanaging warden. I didn't realize how deep the damage went until I started talking more with the neighbors who had been under Karen's thumb the longest. One woman told me Karen fined her every month for leaving her garbage cans out more than 30 minutes after pickup, even though she worked a night shift and literally couldn't make it back in time. Another man admitted that Karen tried to have his birdbath removed because it attracted non-approved wildlife. And then there was the young couple who'd been too nervous to build a backyard swing set for their kids after Karen showed up one afternoon with a measuring tape and declared the structure too commercial looking. These people weren't just irritated, they'd been steamrolled. and I had unintentionally become the guy who gave them permission to fight back. Dennis invited me to the next board meeting, not as a speaker, just to observe. I walked in expecting it to be another dry session with paperwork and dull discussion, but instead, it was electric. Residents stood up and offered real suggestions. A retired architect volunteered to redesign the community park layout. A high school student offered to build a free lending library stand for the front entrance. Someone even brought donuts. And Dennis made a point to bring up the topic that had kick-started the revolution, the barn incident. He cleared his throat and said with a slight smile that while unorthodox, sometimes the clearest message is the one you don't see coming until it hits you square in the nose. Laughter broke out, and for the first time ever, the HOA minutes included the word manure. Meanwhile, Karen had not given up entirely. She kept trying to claw back her influence by handing out flyers around the neighborhood with dramatic titles like "The Truth They Won't Tell You" and "Restoring Order to Our Community." The only problem was, no one was listening. The same neighbors who once nodded politely when she barked instructions now simply shut their doors, pulled their blinds, or in one case, offered her a cookie shaped like a goat and said no thanks. Her blog, which she called Suburban Elegance, was her last-ditch attempt to stay relevant. She filled it with snide little articles about community disorder, unnamed threats to peace, and the dangers of letting rural mindsets pollute curated environments. I made the mistake of reading one entry and nearly spit coffee out of my nose when she described my barn as an unauthorized rustic attraction. It became an inside joke between neighbors. Someone put up a hand-painted sign at the trail entrance that read "Caution, Approaching Unauthorized Rustic Attraction." Beneath it, a wooden arrow pointed toward my barn, and someone else taped a photo of the Equalizer underneath with a caption that said "Bring nose plugs and snacks." Despite the running joke, I wasn't planning to keep the spotlight on myself forever. I had fields to tend, fences to mend, and a growing to-do list that didn't include HOA drama. But things had a way of finding me now. A week after the meeting, I got a knock on the door from a man with a local press badge. He introduced himself as Paul, a features writer who had been following the viral manure video saga. He wanted to do a deeper piece, something beyond the memes and headlines. At first, I hesitated. I didn't want to become some local legend for firing off one well-timed spray of farm sludge. But Paul was persistent. He asked questions no one else had, about the way the community had changed, about the damage HOA politics could do, about why people had let it go so far before anyone spoke up, and he framed it in a way that hit home. He said maybe this wasn't a story about fertilizer. Maybe it was a story about boundaries, not just property lines but personal ones. So I gave him the interview. We walked around the property while I talked, pointing out the original foundation posts of the barn, the apple tree that Karen once claimed blocked her walking path, and the field where I planned to build a small shelter for injured wildlife. He asked about the Equalizer, and I explained how I kept it functional out of habit, not because I ever thought I'd use it like that. He laughed and said sometimes the best tools get their moment in the sun by accident. A week later, the article came out with the headline "How One Farmer's Wagon Sparked a Community Revolution." It was thoughtful, respectful, and honest. And it ended with a quote I didn't even remember saying. Sometimes you don't know how far people have been pushed until someone finally pushes back. That article brought a wave of new messages, some from nearby towns dealing with their own HOA horror stories. I even got a handwritten letter from a man in another state who said he'd been bullied by his HOA for years over a veterans' memorial bench he put in his front yard. He said the story gave him the courage to take his case public. It was humbling and unexpected. I hadn't set out to be a symbol. I just wanted to protect what was mine. But sometimes, drawing a line in the mud makes it easier for others to find solid ground. The new HOA board continued making changes, and Dennis even invited me to help draft a new section in the community charter about property boundaries and resident consent. I agreed, but only if I could keep it simple and clear. No more vague phrasing like community aesthetics or shared visual harmony. We needed language that couldn't be twisted by people like Karen. Direct, honest, fair. So we sat down over iced tea one Saturday and wrote it out. By the end of the day, we had what Dennis called the Plain Talk Amendment. It passed unanimously a week later. As for Karen, she didn't take kindly to the vote or the article. One evening I caught her walking the trail behind my barn again, phone in hand, taking pictures through the fence. She didn't say a word when I stepped out. Just turned and walked briskly away. The next morning, I installed a new sprinkler system along the fence line, motion activated, just in case her curiosity overpowered her memory. I called it the Equalizer Junior, quiet, subtle, but ready to defend the border. The barn eventually went back to being just a barn. The manure wagon went back to its usual duties, hauling compost to the far field. But I kept a small wooden plaque mounted above the barn doors, engraved by one of the neighbors. It said "Property of the People," a reminder not just of what happened, but of how fast everything can change when one person decides enough is enough. Summer settled in fully by the time the last ripple of Karen's rain faded into the background. The fields had turned lush and thick, the barn smelled of fresh hay instead of disaster, and the Equalizer had been officially retired to a quiet corner under a tarp, like a veteran resting after one glorious mission. I thought that would be the end of it. No more drama, no more flyers slipped under my gate, no more pop-up HOA meetings about the angle of my weather vane. But just when you think a storm has passed, you hear thunder in the distance and remember nature always has one more surprise. That surprise came in the form of Karen's final desperate attempt to regain power, and this time, she wasn't aiming for the HOA, she was aiming for spectacle. It started with a letter. Not just any letter, but a thick envelope sealed in wax like it was from the Queen herself. Delivered by hand, no return address, just left on my porch. I opened it expecting some ridiculous cease and desist, but instead, it was an invitation. Karen was hosting what she called a rebranding celebration. The goal, she wrote, was to restore community pride and erase the stigma of recent events. It would include a speech, a catered lunch, and a rededication of shared spaces. Most laughable of all, she wanted to feature a symbolic walk along the publicly visible barn trail, concluding at my property line, where she planned to deliver what she described as a unifying message of forgiveness. I had to read that part 3 times. Forgiveness. From her. To us. For what, exactly, she didn't say. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled coffee on the invitation. At first, I thought I'd ignore it. Let her have her little event. But something about the way she framed it gnawed at me. She was trying to rewrite the whole saga, make it sound like she was the victim turned peacemaker. It wasn't enough for her to fall. She needed to land on a platform. I called Dennis to ask if he'd heard about it. He sighed and said yes, she'd applied for a permit to host it in the cul-de-sac by the walking trail. Apparently, she'd even rented a podium and arranged for a photographer again, though this time with strict, no animal rules. The gall of it was beyond reason. She'd learned nothing. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Some people thought it was hilarious. Others worried she was trying to sneak her way back into a position of influence. A few suggested a counterparty, but that felt too petty. I didn't want to fight her with flyers or speeches. I wanted her to feel the weight of her own absurdity. And then, as I stood behind the barn later that day, refilling the goat trough and watching the sun dip behind the ridge, the idea came. It was subtle. It was silent. And it was going to be absolutely perfect. The day of the event arrived with more drama than a county fair bake-off. Karen showed up early in a pastel pantsuit that looked like it had been ironed by angels. Her hair was pinned high, her makeup flawless, her expression tight with self-importance. She barked orders at the caterers setting up folding tables covered in finger sandwiches and fruit platters. A small speaker system was mounted beside the podium, and a printed banner reading "Moving Forward Together" drooped slightly in the breeze. Her photographer wore a vest labeled "Press Access Only," though nobody could figure out what outlet he worked for. People started trickling in. Some were just curious, others wanted to see if Karen would say something insane again. I stood near my fence, leaning on the post like any other onlooker. I kept my expression neutral, my hands in my pockets, and every so often, I sipped from a lemonade bottle just to complete the image. Karen ignored me at first, but I saw her glance my way several times. That performative calm, that fake grace she always wore when she thought she was winning. But she wasn't. She just didn't know yet. Karen stepped up to the podium, cleared her throat, and began her speech. She spoke of healing and misunderstanding, of reputational damage and the need to restore harmony. She said things like visual territory and historical misrepresentation. She never once mentioned trespassing or forged permission slips or flying fertilizer. To hear her tell it, she had simply tried to beautify a corner of the world and been met with overreaction. She ended her speech with a gesture toward the walking trail and said she would now take a symbolic stroll to the site of last year's event to demonstrate that we could move forward without fear. The walk began. A handful of people followed her, mostly curious or too polite to peel away. She approached the trail behind the barn, the spot where it all began, where her chaos collided with common sense. The grass was trimmed, the path clean, everything serene. But as she neared the fence, she triggered the motion sensor I had installed 2 weeks earlier. At first, it looked like nothing had happened. She paused, tilted her head. Then it started. The sprinklers I had mounted along the fence sprayed in perfect unison. Not manure, not even dirty water. Just plain recycled barn rainwater, pumped from the cistern I used to irrigate the upper field. But I had mixed in a harmless food-grade blue dye, the kind used in pond treatments. It was perfectly safe, completely odorless, and extremely visible. Within seconds, Karen's pale suit turned splotchy turquoise, the color blooming across her jacket like ink on a napkin. The crowd gasped. A few people stifled laugh. One kid openly pointed and shouted she's turning into a Smurf. Karen froze, stunned, hands out like she could stop the water by sheer willpower. The sprinklers shut off automatically after 15 seconds. The silence afterward was louder than any speech. She turned slowly, eyes wide, mascara beginning to run down her cheek. I stayed where I was, sipping my lemonade. We locked eyes for just a second. Then I raised the bottle slightly in a quiet toast. She spun and stomped off the trail, the sound of her wet shoes squelching against the pavement. The event ended shortly after. The guests trickled away, some laughing, others shaking their heads. No one offered to help her clean up. The caterers packed quickly, and the banner flapped sadly in the wind until someone took it down and folded it neatly on a bench. The photographer had vanished, though rumor had it he sold the photos to a local satire blog later that day. I didn't need to post any videos this time. Everyone had seen it, and this time she had walked straight into it with no one to blame but herself. That evening, the neighborhood felt lighter than ever. Kids played on driveways, someone grilled hot dogs near the park, and an older couple walked their dog past the barn, nodding at me with quiet approval. I went back inside and opened a new email from the HOA board. They were finalizing the last draft of the Plain Talk Amendment and wanted to name the clause about visual boundaries after the barn incident. They asked what I'd like it to be called. I replied simply, the Equalizer rule.